People like you don't fly first class. Step aside. That sentence, sharp as a blade, came from the mouth of a young gate agent wearing Starwing Airlines uniform, and it cut through the noise of JFK Airport like a gunshot in a quiet room. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few turned their heads, a few smirked, others looked away, uncomfortable. And the man she said it to? Malcolm Carter, black, 42 years old, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit and polished Oxfords, calm, quiet, holding a first-class boarding pass. But none of that seemed to matter, in that moment. What mattered most to her was the color of his skin. Before we begin this powerful story, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below, and if you believe in justice, fairness, and human dignity, take a moment to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. Now, take a deep breath, and come with me into a true story that will stay with you long after it ends. It was Friday morning, late autumn in New York City. JFK's Terminal 4 buzzed like a hive. Departure boards blinked in rhythm. Wheels of suitcases rolled across cold tile floors. Loudspeakers crackled overhead with flight updates and final calls. In the middle of that controlled chaos stood Malcolm Carter, CEO of Horizon Innovations, a multi-billion-dollar tech company he built from nothing. This flight to San Francisco was supposed to be another step forward in his journey. He had a $750 million meeting waiting on the West Coast. But more than that, today's flight was also a silent audit. Horizon was planning to award a $4.2 billion global transportation contract to one of three major airlines. Starwing was on the list. Malcolm wasn't just flying. He was evaluating. Yet none of that was visible to the staff who judged him the moment he walked up at the check-in counter. A young woman named Emily Harper barely glanced up from her monitor. She didn't greet him, didn't ask for ID. Her eyes moved from his face to his clothes, then back to her screen. "You're looking for the economy line," she said flatly, without even verifying his ticket. Malcolm simply slid his passport and boarding pass across the counter. She picked them up with 2 fingers, like they were dirty. Her lips tightened. Then, reluctantly, she typed, "Gate 12C, she mumbled. "They'll sort you out." No smile, no apology, no acknowledgement of his class of service, just dismissal. As Malcolm made his way through security, he noticed the tone shifting again. The TSA officer, Tom Reynolds, broad-shouldered and abrupt, flagged his bag without explanation. He was pulled aside, patted down aggressively, and questioned twice about where he was headed and why. Passengers behind him watched, murmured, and a few filmed on their phones. He kept calm. He always kept calm, but he felt it building. That slow, quiet anger in the pit of his chest. The kind he'd carried since he was a kid in the Bronx being followed in convenience stores. The kind that never really leaves. By the time he reached Gate 12C, boarding had begun for Flight 827 to San Francisco. 2 lines had formed, one for economy, winding and crowded, the other, sleek and quick, for first class. Malcolm walked confidently to the front of the first-class line. The gate agent, Sarah Mitchell, looked up and immediately stiffened. "Can I see your boarding pass?" she asked, suspicious. He handed it over. She studied it as if it might be fake. Her eyes narrowed. "I'll need to run some additional checks," she said curtly. "Please step aside." "Is there an issue?" Malcolm asked, voice still even. "Just procedure," she snapped. That was a lie, and they both knew it. Moments later, she called over security. It was Tom Reynolds again. "We need to move him for further screening," she said. Malcolm stood his ground. "This is the second time I'm being screened," he said firmly, "and I've done nothing to justify it." Tom didn't respond. He just reached for Malcolm's arm. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The tension was now thick. Several passengers paused their conversations. A woman nearby shook her head. A man pulled out his phone, recording. Malcolm slowly backed away, not out of fear, but restraint. He knew exactly what was happening. He had lived it, again and again, and yet, this time felt different. This time, he wasn't alone. Whispers moved through the crowd. "Isn't that the guy from CNBC? That's Malcolm Carter, right? The tech CEO?" The name began to ripple, but the staff at Starwing seemed oblivious. Or maybe they didn't care. He was taken to a separate customer service desk, where he met Robert Daniels, the station manager. "We're experiencing technical delays," Robert said without looking up. "You might miss this flight. Systems are down." Malcolm pointed at the display screen above the counter. Flight 827 was still listed as on time. "Let me get this straight," he said quietly. "I've been checked in. My boarding pass is valid. Your system isn't showing any errors. And you're still not letting me board?" Robert didn't answer. He just gave that shrug, the one that says, "We don't have to explain." A little boy nearby tugged on his mother's coat and asked, "Why are they stopping that man?" The mother looked away, but the question lingered. Malcolm felt it in his spine, the quiet injustice, the kind that leaves no bruises, but still wounds. Then, without changing his expression, he pulled out his phone. He dialed. "Jameson," he said calmly. "It's begun, Gate 12C. You know what to do. Execute the plan, pull the contract, and sell the shares." What no one around him knew, not the gate agent, not the security guard, not even the onlookers, was that Malcolm Carter wasn't just a wealthy traveler. He was the largest shareholder of Starwing Airlines, 32%. And that phone call? That wasn't a complaint. It was a command, a lever pulled, a reckoning set in motion. He wasn't born with a silver spoon. He forged it in fire, long before Malcolm Carter became the CEO of Horizon Innovations, or the man holding the fate of a $4.2 billion contract in his hands. He was just a quiet, observant boy growing up in a cramped apartment in the South Bronx. He'd watched his mother, head held high, hands cracked from cleaning houses, teach him that dignity had nothing to do with money and everything to do with how you carried yourself. His father, a janitor who never missed a day of work, once told him, "Son, they might not see you coming, but when you arrive, make sure they can't ignore you." That stuck with him, as a child. Malcolm devoured books by flashlight under a thinning blanket while sirens wailed outside. He taught himself code by the time he was 13, rebuilt old computers from scrapyard parts, and created his first software platform by 17. But the world wasn't eager to welcome him. Doors slammed in his face with a smile. He was too young, too ambitious, or simply not the right fit. But he knew what they really meant. It wasn't just age or confidence. It was that he didn't look like the people who sat on their side of the table. He watched colleagues get credit for ideas he pitched, saw his innovations buried under someone else's name. It burned, but it didn't break him. Instead, he built. From a one-bedroom rental filled with cables and cold pizza boxes, he launched Horizon Innovations, a startup born out of necessity and fueled by rage, brilliance, and grit. He worked 70-hour weeks, lived off ramen, and reinvested every penny. Within 5 years, Horizon cracked the top 10 in enterprise software. Within 10. It was a global powerhouse, providing AI-integrated systems to Fortune 500 companies, major hospitals, and the U.S. Department of Energy. Malcolm became the youngest black CEO to ring the NASDAQ opening bell, but through all the success, he never forgot what it felt like to be underestimated. That's why this trip mattered so much. The Global Tech Summit in San Francisco was more than a business opportunity. It was personal. The $750 million venture deal he was about to close would fund 3 massive community initiatives, one in New York to teach coding to underserved youth, one in Detroit to support minority-owned startups, and one in Atlanta to incubate women in tech. He wasn't flying first class for luxury. He was flying on business, strategic business. And Starwing Airlines was one of 3 finalists for Horizon's Global Transport Partnership, worth $4.2 billion over 10 years. This flight wasn't just a trip, it was an evaluation. Malcolm wanted to experience their service anonymously, like any high-level client would. No VIP alerts, no special treatment, just a real-world test. And what he got was prejudice on full display. Now, sitting in a cold, soulless customer service nook in Terminal 4, he watched as the same gate agents and staff who had questioned his right to be there moved with blind confidence, assuming their words had no weight and their actions would go unanswered. Robert Daniels, the customer service manager, had returned to his post, sipping lukewarm coffee and avoiding Malcolm's gaze. The monitors above flickered back online. Passengers resumed boarding. Malcolm remained seated, silent, seemingly calm, but boiling underneath. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but today, the pattern was too familiar. He thought about the many times he'd been pulled aside for random checks, the client meetings where he'd been mistaken for the assistant, and the private golf clubs where security had followed him hole to hole. He'd always carried it with dignity. But now, this was no longer about his pride. It was about principle. He could no longer allow this system to operate unchecked. He looked down at his phone. Jameson Lee, his chief operating officer, had already begun executing the strategy they had designed months ago. Just in case. Protocol Alpha, they called it. Malcolm had hoped never to use it. It was built in secret. A full audit and contingency plan tied to the transportation contract, triggered only if Starwing failed its integrity benchmark. And now, it had, as per the plan. Horizon's procurement office had officially withdrawn Starwing from consideration. The Horizon Board, already briefed on Malcolm's real-time report, voted unanimously to reassign the $4.2 billion contract to United Airlines instead. Legal was already preparing the paperwork. Malcolm's 32% stake in Starwing, quietly accumulated through a subsidiary, was also now in motion. Nicole Evans, his executive assistant and lead counsel, had begun selling the shares in blocks. The implications were massive. Starwing's valuation, already shaky from recent PR scandals, would plummet once news hit the market. And that wasn't all. Horizon also had a pending ethics investigation into its suppliers. Malcolm had sat on that file for 6 months. Inside it were internal emails from Starwing executives mocking diversity training, documented pay gaps along racial lines, and first-hand testimonies from former employees, some of whom had reached out after seeing him speak at a leadership summit. He had the receipts, all of them, and they were ready to be delivered. At that moment, Malcolm's phone buzzed. A message from Nicole. Shares moving, media ping incoming, prepare for impact. He stood up slowly, buttoned his jacket, and walked calmly toward the gate. Sarah Mitchell was still checking boarding passes, pretending not to notice him. Tom Reynolds, the security officer, stood nearby, arms crossed. Malcolm stepped onto a chair near the gate. Eyes turned. Conversations stopped. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with quiet strength, "my name is Malcolm Carter. I'm the CEO of Horizon Innovations. You may have seen how I've been treated here today. What you may not know is that I'm also the largest shareholder of Starwing Airlines. That ends today." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones were raised, cameras recording. A murmur built into a roar. Some passengers clapped, others stood in disbelief. Malcolm didn't need to shout. His truth was louder than anything a speaker could blast through the terminal. Starwing had just triggered its own downfall, and the world was about to watch it collapse. In real time. The moment Malcolm stepped onto the chair at Gate 12C and revealed who he was, the entire terminal seemed to freeze. Phones rose in unison, some already live streaming, others snapping photos. His voice remained steady, deliberate. He didn't need to shout. His words were cutting through the noise like a scalpel. I was denied boarding today, not because of a problem with my ticket, but because of a problem with how I look, he said. And while that may be familiar to many of us, what's different this time is that I have the means to respond. His eyes scanned the crowd, some passengers wide-eyed, others slowly nodding in understanding. Behind him, Sarah Mitchell's face drained of color. Tom Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, arms now uncrossed. Robert Daniels reappeared at the edge of the gate. Holding a walkie-talkie he no longer dared to speak into, Malcolm continued. Effective as of 10 minutes ago, Horizon Innovations has withdrawn Starwing Airlines from a $4.2 billion transportation contract. That alone will wipe out your growth projections for the next decade. Gasps followed. Heads turned toward one another. And additionally, he said, pausing just enough for the tension to thicken, my company has sold our 32% stake in Starwing. The shares are being offloaded as we speak. The news hit like a thunderclap. Several passengers checked their phones. One investor-looking man gasped and whispered, "He's crashing the stock." A few screens on nearby tablets and laptops began flashing headlines. Breaking, Horizon dumps, Starwing shares amid discrimination allegations. Airport staff nearby looked helpless, unsure whether to continue boarding or abandon the gate. The crowd around Malcolm wasn't just listening. They were bearing witness. And then, from the back of the terminal, a woman's voice rang out. "You're not alone. Mr. Carter." It was Lisa Thompson, mid-40s, black, a frequent flyer. She stepped forward with purpose, holding her phone high. "They downgraded me last month with no explanation. Said the flight was overbooked, but my original seat stayed empty." Another voice followed, an older Asian man in a business suit. "I've had them move me twice in the last year, always when I board early, always after they check my name." It was Michael Chen. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Lisa. The crowd murmured in shock. What began as one man's injustice was now revealing itself as a pattern. Malcolm looked at them, nodded, then turned back to the staff. "This isn't just about me. It never was. It's about a culture that lets this behavior fester behind procedure and policy." His phone buzzed again. A message from Nicole. "Dow Jones alert. Starwing stock down 18.32%. Financial Times calling in 2 men. You're trending." He pocketed the phone. At that moment, cameras from local news crews came streaming through the concourse. One had clearly been tipped off. Another likely saw the viral posts and dispatched a team immediately. Within seconds, Malcolm was surrounded by microphones. "Mr. Carter, is it true you've pulled all contracts with Starwing? Are you planning legal action? What exactly happened here today?" He held up his hand. "All your questions will be answered, but not just by me. My legal team will arrive shortly with documented evidence. This is no longer just about an incident at a gate. It's about exposing what happens in plain sight when nobody with power is watching." One of the cameras panned across the staff. Sarah Mitchell looked like she wanted to disappear. Tom Reynolds quietly walked away. Robert Daniels sat down and buried his face in his hands. Then, cutting through the reporters, a tall man in a designer suit stormed in. David Thornton, CEO of Starwing Airlines himself. He looked furious, then desperate. "Malcolm," he said through a tight smile, "I believe we've had a misunderstanding. Let's talk. Privately." Malcolm didn't flinch. "There's nothing private about this. David, your team's behavior speaks louder than your PR statements ever could." David gestured broadly. "I can get you on a private jet. No fuss. Let's correct this." "You think this is about a seat?" Malcolm replied, calm but steel-edged. "You're still not listening." David glanced at the reporters, then leaned in, whispering, "You don't want to go nuclear on this. We can fix it quietly. Name your terms." Malcolm stepped back. You should have thought of that before your employees treated me like a criminal in front of 200 witnesses. The media devoured every word. Lisa Thompson and Michael Chen stood by, backing him up. The story was no longer an allegation. It was becoming a movement. Just then, a familiar voice called out from behind the security barrier. "Malcolm!" It was Nicole Evans, arriving with 2 legal associates in tow. She held a thick leather folder labeled Confidential and a white envelope marked Star Wing Board of Directors. "We have the files ready," she said. "Emails, testimonies, statistics, everything." Malcolm turned to the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, within this folder is 6 months of documentation, a full internal review of Star Wing's discriminatory practices. If they don't take responsibility, we'll make it public." A beat passed. The reporters leaned in. "What do you hope to accomplish?" one asked. Malcolm looked around the terminal, at the staff, the passengers, the phones still recording. "Change," he said. "I didn't come here looking for a fight, but I won't walk away from one, either. Not when people are being silenced, sidelined, or humiliated simply because of who they are." A young black boy nearby tugged his father's arm and whispered, "Dad, that man's not afraid of them." His father smiled. "No, son, he isn't. That's called leadership." The atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just outrage anymore. It was clarity. This wasn't a headline. It was history in motion. And Malcolm Carter had just lit the fuse. The energy at Gate 12C had shifted from shock to spectacle, but not the kind Star Wing Airlines had ever planned for. Cameras now circled Malcolm Carter like satellites, recording every move, every word, every expression. Passengers who moments earlier were impatiently scrolling through boarding announcements now stood in full silence, watching history unfold. The terminal no longer felt like an airport. It felt like a courtroom, and Malcolm stood not just as a witness, but as the lead prosecutor, holding receipts no one could ignore, just as he finished speaking. The main entrance doors swung open and a second wave of press poured in, followed closely by airport officials and 2 uniformed officers, one of whom was Officer Daniel Brooks, a seasoned airport police veteran with a quiet air of authority. He recognized Malcolm immediately. "Mr. Carter, sir," he said with a respectful nod. "We're here to ensure this situation stays peaceful. Let me know if you need anything." Malcolm gave him a firm nod of gratitude. Then, amidst the thick cloud of camera flashes, came a new voice, sharp, nervous, authoritative. "We need to contain this." It was David Thornton again, CEO of Star Wing, this time clearly rattled. He had returned after briefly disappearing, his tie loosened, forehead damp, and voice cracking slightly. "Mr. Carter, I'm asking again. Can we speak somewhere private?" Malcolm didn't budge. "You're still misunderstanding the moment. David, this isn't a PR mess. This is a moral failure." The reporters leaned in. David stepped closer, lowering his voice, but the nearby mics still picked up everything. "I'm trying to avoid legal exposure for the company. This could cost us everything. Help me out here." Malcolm folded his arms. "I already gave you the help. I gave it to your gate agents when I presented a valid first-class ticket. I gave it to your manager when I calmly asked for an explanation. And I gave it to your airline when I chose to fly with you in good faith. But your people failed. So now, I'm doing what I always do, holding people accountable." David looked like a man unraveling. He turned to his assistant, whispered something urgently, then wiped his forehead again. But before he could speak further, Nicole Evans, Malcolm's executive assistant, walked forward holding the leather folder. She opened it calmly and began distributing copies of its contents to the press and to Star Wing legal counsel. Inside were hard facts, internal emails from executives mocking diversity programs, recordings of staff training sessions where bias was never addressed, and passenger complaints ignored or quietly deleted. Then came the employee testimonies, anonymized, but detailed, describing patterns of racist language, denial of service upgrades, and retaliation for speaking out. The reporters were eating it up. They flipped pages, eyes wide, some already dictating quotes into their phones. One journalist from the New York Times turned to his cameraman and whispered, "This is bigger than just one airline." And then, the moment came. A low chime from Nicole's phone. She looked up. "The board is in emergency session," she said. "They've agreed to meet Malcolm now, here at the airport." David's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? They can't just—" "They already did," Nicole cut in. "You're on borrowed time." Within 15 minutes, a section of the premium lounge at Terminal 4 had been cleared and converted into a makeshift boardroom. Starwing's senior board members, some joining via live video, others rushed in by black SUVs, took their places around the long table. The room, usually reserved for elite travelers sipping champagne, was now a war room. Dr. Angela Ruiz, a calm but stern Latina in her 50s and the interim chair of the board, led the proceedings. "Mr. Carter, we understand you've presented grave concerns. Please proceed." Malcolm stood at the head of the table. No script in hand, no prepared statement, just truth. He spoke of what had happened, not only today, but of the cultural rot he had observed festering within Starwing for months. He cited specific cases, quoted lines from internal emails, read aloud testimonies that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. One executive, visibly shaken, asked, "How did we not know about this?" Malcolm didn't answer. He just handed them a copy of their own employee satisfaction survey results. Data they had apparently never reviewed in full, which showed consistent complaints of bias, favoritism, and abuse from minority staff and passengers alike. Dr. Ruiz remained quiet for a moment, then asked, "Mr. Thornton, would you like to respond?" David stood slowly, his face pale. This is being taken out of context. We've always supported diversity." But his voice broke, literally. He clutched his chest, stumbled back into his chair, and began gasping. Paramedics were called immediately. A hush fell over the room as David Thornton, CEO of Starwing Airlines, was wheeled out on a stretcher, suffering from what doctors later confirmed was a panic-induced cardiac episode. The board sat in stunned silence. Dr. Ruiz took a deep breath. Given the gravity of the documentation provided and Mr. Thornton's inability to continue in his role, we are voting immediately on executive leadership. One by one, hands were raised. In less than 10 minutes, David Thornton was officially suspended. Dr. Angela Ruiz was named acting CEO. The board voted unanimously to temporarily ground all Starwing domestic flights for internal review and retraining, effective immediately. The decision sent shockwaves through the industry. Within hours, news outlets across the globe ran headlines like "Starwing grounded, CEO collapses, board ousted after discrimination revelations at the terminal." Stunned passengers learned their flights were being canceled or rerouted. But for the first time, most weren't angry. They were understanding. Some even applauded. A black woman holding a baby whispered, "It's about time someone stood up." Back in the lounge, Malcolm sat down, exhausted but resolute. One board member looked at him and asked, "What are you hoping to gain from this, Mr. Carter?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "I'm not here to gain. I'm here to prevent this from ever happening to someone who doesn't have the power I do." The room fell quiet again, and for the first time that day, even those who had doubted him began to truly listen. The lounge was quiet now, but the silence carried the weight of something historic. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from confusion or fear. It was the kind that comes when truth has finally cracked through denial. after the vote to suspend David Thornton and ground Starwing's flights. The board sat frozen for a few moments, stunned by how fast everything had unraveled. Malcolm Carter stood calmly, his hands resting on the edge of the conference table, watching the faces around him, some humbled, some horrified, some just trying to figure out how this could have gone unnoticed for so long. Dr. Angela Ruiz, now interim CEO, cleared her throat and addressed the room. "What happened today was not an isolated mistake," she said, her voice steady. "It was the result of a culture that we, whether by ignorance, arrogance, or indifference, allowed to grow unchecked. That ends now." A few board members nodded. Others looked away. Some stared at Malcolm, unsure whether to thank him or fear him. Nicole Evans, still seated at the end of the table, passed around a final document, an official cease operations directive. The cost of grounding every Starwing flight, even for 48 hours, would exceed $100 million in revenue losses. But Dr. Ruiz signed it without hesitation. "We cannot operate while infected by a system that permits this kind of discrimination," she said. "We owe our passengers and our employees more than a press release." Malcolm spoke next, and he didn't hold back. "This was never about revenge. It's about accountability. You can repaint your aircraft, redesign your logos, launch marketing campaigns, but until you deal with what's broken beneath, nothing changes. I've seen this before, so have millions of people watching this unfold right now. What they want isn't a statement. They want justice, and they want to know someone is finally taking them seriously." One board member tried to offer a justification. "But Mr. Carter, you were profiled unfairly. We can all see that now. But was grounding the entire airline really necessary?" Malcolm looked directly at him. "You're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether I was mistreated. The question is, how many people have been mistreated and had no voice, no cameras, no legal team, no stock to crash, no name to protect them?" The room went still. That was the question that changed everything. Nicole nodded quietly. She had compiled dozens of cases during their private investigation. Passengers denied boarding, downgraded without explanation, loyalty members overlooked for upgrades, even employees fired after reporting racial hostility, names, dates, emails, all ignored by Starwing until today. Malcolm continued. "I'm not here because I was disrespected. I'm here because this happens to people every day. People who never make the news. You just made the mistake of doing it to someone with leverage." The words hung in the air like thunder, outside the glass walls of the lounge. The ripple effect had already begun. Airline staff scrambled to reschedule canceled flights. Announcements rang out across terminals. "Attention all passengers on Starwing Airlines Flight 827 to San Francisco. This flight has been canceled due to internal operational decisions. Please proceed to customer service for rebooking or refunds." But for once, the passengers weren't shouting or throwing tantrums. They stood quietly, watching news unfold live on their screens. The headlines were everywhere. Black CEO crashes Starwing after racial discrimination incident. Starwing grounded. CEO removed in shock turnaround. Accountability in the air. One man forces change. Malcolm stepped away from the boardroom and found a quiet spot in the lounge to sit. He was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. The weight of it all had started to settle in. He wasn't angry anymore. He was reflective. The fight he waged today had started decades ago. In boardrooms where he'd been talked over, in classrooms where he'd been underestimated, in airports where he'd been ignored. This wasn't a spontaneous explosion. This was the result of years of restraint, grace, and grit. Dr. Ruiz joined him a few minutes later. She sat down across from him with a sigh. "You know, I came from nothing too," she said. "My parents were immigrants. I worked my way up. I thought I understood what discrimination looked like, but I didn't see this coming. Not from our own people." Malcolm looked at her with tired eyes. It's not always about what we see. It's about what we're willing to confront once we finally do. She nodded. We're going to need your help. Malcolm, we need to rebuild Star Wing from the inside out. Not just the operations, the culture. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out the window where a row of grounded aircraft sat idle, their engines silent, their future uncertain. Then he finally said, I'll help, but not as a consultant, not for money. I'll help because I know what's at stake if we don't fix it. At that moment, Jameson Lee, Horizon's COO, texted with an update. All shares sold. Contract officially moved to United. PR teams aligned. Social support over 92% positive. Malcolm smiled faintly, not because he won, but because the system had finally been forced to look at itself in the mirror. He stood up, walked back into the boardroom, and addressed the group one final time. This is your reset button, he said. Don't waste it. Reform doesn't start with slogans. It starts with policies, hiring, promotion practices, accountability systems, and how you treat the people with the least power. That's what defines who you are, not your quarterly reports. As he left the room, cameras followed. Reporters shouted questions, but he waved them off. He wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity. He didn't want a book deal or a speaking tour. What he wanted was to never see another young black traveler pulled aside for random checks without cause. He wanted Lisa Thompson to board a plane without suspicion. He wanted Michael Chen to sit in first class without being told it was a mistake. He wanted the next generation to fly without fear. Malcolm Carter hadn't just shut down an airline's operations. He had cracked open its soul. And now, with the board reshuffled, the flights grounded, and the world watching, the real work of change could finally begin. The fallout was immediate and seismic. Within 24 hours of Star Wing Airlines grounding its fleet, the aviation industry reeled like a shaken beehive. Stock analysts issued urgent downgrades. Travel blogs exploded with speculation. And airline CEOs across the country called emergency meetings with their diversity officers, some of whom, until that day, had been little more than figureheads. By the end of the weekend, 3 of Star Wing's competitors, United, Delta, and American, announced sweeping internal reviews of their passenger service protocols. They didn't wait for regulators to force change. They saw the writing on the wall. The Department of Transportation followed quickly, issuing a nationwide bulletin proposing new transparency regulations, all U.S.-based airlines would soon be required to collect and publish data on passenger treatment by race, gender, and class of service. What Malcolm Carter had triggered at Gate 12C wasn't just a reckoning for one airline. It was a shift in the sky itself. Meanwhile, Malcolm remained quiet in public, but active behind the scenes. He declined interview requests. He turned down speaking invitations. Instead, he focused on 2 things: reforming Star Wing from within and finalizing the $750 million venture deal in San Francisco, which was completed just 1 week later, fully intact. The partners didn't back out. In fact, they doubled down, citing Horizon's leadership and integrity as rare assets in today's corporate world. Malcolm redirected $100 million from that deal into a new fund, the Skyline Equity Initiative, dedicated to investigating, documenting, and eliminating systemic bias in service-based industries. Within a month, the fund had already deployed grants to underrepresented aviation students, legal teams fighting airline discrimination cases, and a startup developing AI tools to track passenger mistreatment in real time at Star Wing. The changes ran deeper than press releases. Dr. Angela Ruiz acted swiftly. Every employee from executive to flight crew was required to undergo mandatory anti-bias and restorative justice training. Not the watered-down corporate kind, but the hard, honest, immersive kind that left people uncomfortable and changed. A new diversity oversight committee was created, with independent members selected by civil rights organizations. Anonymous reporting systems were rebuilt from the ground up, this time with third-party review. The company partnered with several historically black colleges and tribal universities to create recruitment pipelines, internships, and leadership fast tracks. Gate 12C, once the site of humiliation, became a symbol of transformation. Star Wing redesigned the space entirely. Warm lighting, art installations by marginalized artists, and an interactive digital wall featuring real passenger stories about overcoming bias. Above the gate, a new plaque read, "Justice doesn't begin at 30,000 feet. It begins right here." And 6 months to the day after the incident, Star Wing returned to full operation with a single symbolic flight, New York to San Francisco, the same route Malcolm had intended to take. The flight was operated by an entirely new crew, led by Captain Maria Lopez, Star Wing's first Latina chief pilot. On board were industry leaders, journalists, activists, and everyday passengers who had followed the story from the beginning. The plane, named the Phoenix, taxied down the runway as hundreds watched from the terminal. Passengers stood and applauded as it lifted into the sky, not just because it flew, but because of what it now stood for. Malcolm declined to be on that flight. He chose instead to watch it from the edge of the tarmac, hands in his pockets, standing beside Nicole Evans and Jameson Lee. "They wanted me to cut the ribbon," he said quietly. "But this isn't about me. It never was." Nicole smiled, eyes still on the plane as it disappeared into the clouds. "No, Malcolm, but without you, it never would have happened." That night, a televised special aired across major networks. It chronicled the events of that day at JFK, but more importantly, it highlighted the ripple effect across sectors, banks, hotels, car rental services. Suddenly, customer-facing companies were scrambling to rethink how they trained staff, measured equity, and dealt with complaints. Malcolm's name began to appear not just in tech circles, but in civil rights discussions, business ethics conferences, and even late-night television. People started calling him the Quiet Hammer, a man who didn't yell, didn't threaten, but struck where it mattered most. Investors took note. Policymakers, too. Invitations flooded in from every corner of the world, and while Malcolm remained measured, he knew the time had come to use his influence on a broader scale. He created a coalition called Fair Skies United, bringing together leaders across the travel industry to establish a universal passenger bill of rights centered on dignity, inclusion, and accountability. The initiative garnered bipartisan support in Congress within a year, legislation modeled after it passed into federal law. In a press conference outside the Capitol, Malcolm stood behind the podium in a charcoal suit. No teleprompter, no speech. "I didn't come here to build an empire," he said. "I came to build a mirror and make sure this country finally looks at itself." A round of applause followed, but Malcolm didn't smile. He wasn't here for applause. He was here for results. As the months passed, the story of Gate 12C became a case study in business schools and leadership seminars, not because it was sensational, but because it was real. It was proof that one man, armed with truth, leverage, and clarity of purpose, could force an entire system to stop, rethink, and rebuild. Malcolm Carter didn't just make headlines, he made history. And now, as Star Wing soared again under new leadership, a new culture, and new purpose, the world watched with sharper eyes and higher expectations, because someone finally showed them what accountability in motion really looked like. 6 months after the world watched Star Wing Airlines collapse and begin its resurrection, a press conference was held at the Manhattan Center for Civic Reform. An elegant hall transformed that morning not with flowers or banners, but with faces. Faces of passengers who had once been dismissed. Faces of crew members who had been afraid to speak. Faces of executives now learning to listen. On stage stood Dr. Angela Ruiz, now officially appointed CEO of Star Wing, standing behind a lectern bearing a single word in bold lettering: accountability. The cameras clicked as she stepped forward. "What happened at Gate 12C wasn't a scandal," she said. "It was a spotlight on practices we ignored, complaints we dismissed, and pain we caused. Today, I'm proud to announce the implementation of Star Wing's new equity charter, co-authored by independent civil rights organizations, Malcolm Carter's legal team, and our newly appointed diversity board." She paused, scanning the audience, many nodding in approval. "We've launched a passenger protection system with real-time bias reporting, expanded our recruitment programs into underserved communities, and created a reparations fund for employees and passengers who can demonstrate systemic discrimination over the past 5 years. She gestured toward the first row, where Lisa Thompson and Michael Chen sat beside each other, no longer victims, now symbols. Applause filled the room. Malcolm Carter wasn't on stage. He sat quietly in the back, his presence known but not announced. It wasn't about being in the spotlight anymore. It was about making sure the spotlight never left the truth. Still, everyone in the room knew he was the reason they were all there. Later, outside the hall, a young black reporter caught up with Malcolm as he was leaving. "Mr. Carter, what does this moment mean to you?" Malcolm paused. "It means the pain wasn't wasted. It means the next person who looks like me, talks like me, walks like me, they'll have fewer gates to break through." The clip would later go viral, captioned, "Leadership isn't loud, it's lasting. The story of David Thornton, the ousted Star Wing CEO, also took a surprising turn. After recovering from his health scare and resigning from all corporate positions, he vanished from the public eye for months, but quietly. He had begun volunteering at a nonprofit that mentored underprivileged youth in New Jersey. Later, he reached out to Malcolm privately, not for forgiveness, but for perspective. Their conversation was never made public, but what emerged from it was a new initiative co-sponsored by the Skyline Equity Fund, one that brought together former executives and marginalized youth to sit at the same table and discuss real bias, real power, and real change. Malcolm once told a colleague, "People don't change because you punish them. They change when you show them what their silence cost someone else." That belief guided every reform that followed. And so, as the dust finally settled, as headlines shifted and the world's attention moved on to other things, Malcolm Carter didn't retreat into comfort. He leaned forward into legacy. At the following year's Global Tech Summit, the very summit he never made it to that day, Malcolm was the keynote speaker, not because he closed a big deal, not because of Horizon's continued dominance in the tech space, but because of what he represented. He stepped onto the stage not as a victim, not even as a CEO, but as a man who had walked through fire and emerged with something bigger than profit: purpose. The auditorium fell silent as he began. "A year ago, I stood at an airport gate and was told, without hesitation, that I didn't belong," he said slowly. "Not because of my behavior, not because of my credentials, but because of a story someone else had written in their mind the moment they saw my face." He let the silence settle before continuing. "But instead of shrinking, I stood. Instead of retaliating with anger, I responded with action. And instead of demanding a seat, I built a table." The crowd rose to their feet, but Malcolm raised his hand gently. "This isn't about applause. It's about momentum. You don't need to be a billionaire to make change. You don't need a boardroom or a camera crew. All you need is a moment of clarity and the courage to act on it." Outside the summit, posters of Malcolm stood tall with the words dignity, courage, change, but he didn't linger for interviews or praise. He quietly left the event and returned to what mattered most: mentorship, that weekend. He visited a coding camp funded by the Skyline Equity Initiative in Newark. Among the students was a 14-year-old boy named Deshaun who said, "Mr. Carter, I want to build something that matters, just like you." Malcolm knelt beside him, looked him in the eye, and said, "Then don't just build it. Make sure it helps somebody." That boy would go on to win a national competition in software design the following year. That was Malcolm's legacy, not in balance sheets or titles, but in lives changed. The incident at Gate 12C had begun as a moment of humiliation, but it ended as a movement that proved no injustice is too small to confront. That power, when held by someone with conscience, can become a tool, not for revenge, but for reform. And that one voice, steady, clear, unafraid, can shift the course of an entire industry. Malcolm Carter didn't just walk through a gate, he walked into history. And because he did, the world on the other side looks a little more just, a little more kind, and a whole lot more aware of what dignity truly means. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us tell stories that matter.